Hello, my name is Matthew Yuan, currently a junior attending GSISMUN International School, and it is my utmost honor to welcome you to GSISMUN. I would like to share a story or a lesson that I've been fortunate enough to experience throughout my years being heavily involved within my community, a community that I love and cherish so much, as well as taking the opportunity to go outside and meet new people, thinking as well as experiencing all of the experiences that the world has to offer. And that is that every individual, regardless of one's race, ethnicity, gender, or what their opinions or beliefs are, or their religion, all gifted with special talent and skill. But what is not so evenly distributed amongst all of us are the opportunities and resources that one must need in order to discover that skill, but to make most out of it. Now, before I close off with my very short speech, I would like to take the time to recognize a few individuals outside of GSIS who have helped make this possible. Harry from Dwight, Hugh Kang, and Song from SIS, as well as Joseph Lim from TCIS. Now, I would like to yield my time to our Deputy Secretary General, Samuel O. Thank you.
Honorable delegates, esteemed chairs, and distinguished guests, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second iteration of GSISMUN International School Model United Nations. My name is Samuel O, and it is with joy that I serve as your Deputy Secretary General. Amidst these unprecedented times, the Secretariat team and I will first like to all applaud your heartfelt efforts to continue Model United Nations. From the systemic racism that constantly embattles our nations, to the difficulty in recovering economies in the post-COVID era, we find ourselves in an uncertain future. We have urgent problems in our judicial systems, which have been increasingly apparent with the rise of the Black Lives Movement. And in countries such as Yemen or in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, the urgency for an agreeable solution is of the utmost importance. And all these problems coincide with the difficulties of the COVID era. However, the central goals of our theme, chaos, complacency, creativity, are directly intended to address those problems. For these unexpected challenges require unconventional solutions. From artificial intelligence to our ever-advancing technologies, I hope you utilize all the resources you have available. So instead of falling back onto our traditional MUN solutions, such as raising awareness or simply allocating funds to the problem, I look forward to learning about what innovative ideas you have to address the dilemmas of our day. Thank you. Next, our Secretary General will give his remarks.
Dear distinguished delegates, officers, advisors, and esteemed guests, welcome to the second iteration of the GSISMUN International School Model United Nations Conference. My name is Ethan Kim, and it is my utmost honor to serve as your Secretary General. The aim of GSISMUN is to serve as the platform for debate and discussion. We hope to inspire delegates to arrive at solutions that fully addresses the issue at hand in a constructive manner, as opposed to the likes of simply raising awareness and creating organizations with no unique purpose. For the second year running, GSISMUN 2 is proceeding via an online platform due to COVID-19. The Secretariat sincerely thanks all participants for engaging with Model UN in these trying times. The theme for this conference is chaos, complacency, creativity. In the past year, our world was presented with unprecedented challenges. With extreme climate events and local storms, we saw the alarming impacts of climate change. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic caused chaos across the globe, forcing us to make immense sacrifices. The status quo is best described by the theme of GSISMUN 2. We must listen to our experts and implement 21st century innovations if we are to address the issues humanity faces today. For instance, we cannot shy away from recent developments in robotics and AI when considering the issue of producing and distributing vaccines. Most importantly, to be well prepared for the issues of the future, we need to avoid complacency in our solutions. I hope all delegates approach each issue in a different light, exercising creativity to develop novel solutions. I look forward to watching your collaborative problem-solving efforts and hope that through the 2 days of debate, new friendships may form as well. Thank you. Now, our Model UN advisor, Mr. Brisley, will make a speech.
Welcome to GSISMUN 2. My name is Matt Brisley. I am the director of MUN here at GSIS, and I welcome you to our conference. Thank you to you delegates for all your hard work. Thank you for preparing resolutions. Thank you for putting in the effort to think through these issues. I want to say thank you to our chairs who have put in so much effort to chair reports and to logistics and to running your committees as you'll do in the next 2 days. I especially want to thank the directors of all the clubs for helping students, for serving on the approval panel. I especially want to thank our director here, Ms. Jenny Ahn, who has done tremendous work for arranging the logistics of this conference. And most of all, I want to thank the Secretariat, Matthew, Ethan, and Samuel, for your tireless hard work to prepare this conference. It's come together, and I'm so proud of the work you guys have done, from the hundreds of messages and dozens of emails, late night, 10-minute meets to organize things. You've done a lot of great work, and I'm proud to see what you've done. Our theme for this conference is chaos, creativity, and complacency. And the interaction of those three principles is very difficult to grasp sometimes. We see chaos in many areas of our world, from the civil war in Yemen to racial and ethnic violence in China and the United States. To address these crises, we need to have creativity. We need to reject the complacency that says, oh, there's so much chaos, there's nothing we can do to solve it. But we also must reject the complacency that says that the solutions are easy, that all we must have are good intentions, that we can just throw money at a problem and it'll be solved. Friends, we must be more creative with our solutions. We must shy away from simple cure-alls, and we must work with the institutions that we currently have to solve the problems that we face. One of those cure-alls that sometimes we tend to have, especially in the Security Council, is the use of UN peacekeepers. And to help us understand their role, we're going to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Cale Horn, talk to us about that. Dr. Horn is a professor of political science who holds a PhD from Georgia State University, and he's going to talk to us about the role of peacekeepers in various conflicts around the world. So let's pay attention to him now. And again, thank you for attending this conference, and I hope you guys have a great weekend.
Greetings, delegates. My name is Dr. Cale Horn. I am a professor of political science at Covenant College in the United States, where I teach courses and conduct research on international relations, and I also oversee our Model UN team. It is an honor for me to address the GSIS Model United Nations Conference, and I want to thank Mr. Matthew Brisley for extending this invitation. I'm taking this opportunity to speak to you about my specific area of research, which is United Nations peacekeeping operations. UN peacekeeping has changed dramatically from its origins. During the Cold War, peacekeeping tended to be low-key, usually taking the form of relatively few unarmed or lightly armed observers monitoring combatants already separated by a temporary truce or permanent ceasefire. This pattern includes the UN's very first peacekeeping operations, the UN Truce Supervision Organization, which monitors the armistice between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and the UN Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, which monitors the post-partition ceasefire in Jammu and Kashmir. Both missions have been in place since 1949. After the Cold War, peacekeeping became much more complex, what scholars have called multidimensional peacekeeping, which may involve humanitarian intervention, economic reconstruction and development, social reform, healthcare provision, election management, and reforming critical state institutions such as the police and military. Here, one may think of large missions, such as the UN mission in Liberia, with a mandate ranging from humanitarian and human rights support to security sector reform, and later a responsibility for the country's 2014 Ebola crisis. Or the UN stabilization mission in Haiti, responsible for creating governance and building civil society in an anarchic environment compounded by a devastating 2010 earthquake. Or the comparatively small UN observer mission in El Salvador, which, despite a strength that only numbered several hundred peacekeepers, had responsibilities for restructuring military and police forces, overseeing reforms to the judicial and electoral systems, promoting human rights, and addressing land tenure and other underlying socioeconomic issues believed to contribute to instability and conflict. Very importantly, many post-Cold War peacekeeping operations meant that peacekeepers went from monitoring ceasefires in post-conflict settings to intervening between combatants in active conflicts. These changes in peacekeeping occurred because the end of the Cold War made it easier for the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council to agree on when and where to deploy peacekeeping missions, while the Cold War's end simultaneously increased the demand for peacekeeping as a series of civil wars broke out around the world. This shift also meant that peacekeeping went from primarily monitoring disputes between states to managing conflicts within states. Just before the end of the Cold War, in 1988, only one of the 5 UN peacekeeping operations then active was a civil war, compared to 9 out of the 11 operations established between 1992 and 1994, just after the Cold War. This was an unanticipated situation. Just imagine the UN trying to shift from its mostly low-key operations during the Cold War to a massive worldwide surge in high-risk and high-cost peacekeeping needs brought about by the Cold War's end. Compared to less than 10,000 military personnel deployed globally at the beginning of 1988, more than 73,000 blue helmets were in the field by the end of 1994. Deployments of civilian police grew from a mere 35 to more than 2,100 in the same period. That's a 6,000% increase in less than 7 years. The UN felt the strain almost at once. During the Cold War, a relatively small group of the world's middle powers, mostly European democracies, provided peacekeepers. At the end of the Cold War, the permanent members of the Security Council also began to contribute more peacekeepers, but this wouldn't last. While these states, mostly democracies with highly capable militaries, could field the best peacekeepers in the world, the fact that they were democracies made these countries increasingly reluctant to provide peacekeepers for this new type of complex, violent, expensive, and high-risk post-Cold War peacekeeping. Unlike autocratic states, where leaders rule by force and are mostly unaccountable to their citizens, the leaders of democratic countries must provide policies supported by the majority of voters, or risk replacement in the next election. You may have seen or at least heard of the 2001 film Black Hawk Down, based on a book by the same name, which recounts the deaths of American soldiers deployed as peacekeepers to Somalia. When 19 US soldiers were killed and another 73 wounded in the Battle of Mogadishu on October 3rd and 4th, 1993, fighting for reasons most Americans did not understand, in a country very few Americans could locate on a map, support for these sorts of multilateral actions evaporated in the United States. And this change in sentiment was not confined to a single democracy. Peacekeeper casualties continued to mount across missions, even as UN peacekeepers were blamed, fairly or not, for failing to protect civilians from genocides in Rwanda in 1994 and Srebrenica in 1995. By the turn of the millennium, less than 1/4 of peacekeepers came from the developed and democratic countries, And no developed democratic country, not one, contributed peacekeepers to the UN's largest, most difficult, and most deadly missions. But at the same time that the world's democracies were withdrawing from peacekeeping, demand for peacekeepers continued to grow year after year. And peacekeepers from less developed countries, it turned out, could be fielded for 1/10 the cost of a US or NATO soldier. If you were a leader of a democratic country, unable or unwilling to convince your own citizens of the importance of peacekeeping in far-off lands, what would you do? Outsource. Instead of providing peacekeepers and incurring the wrath of voters, most of the world's developed democracies decided to pay for peacekeepers instead. So where did the new peacekeepers come from? They came from non-democratic countries characterized by government, corruption, and lack of respect for human rights, and frequently those who were only just emerging from bloody civil wars themselves. The victors in post-war countries often found peacekeeping to be a convenient way of getting former rebel factions, newly integrated into their armed forces, out of the way for a while as they consolidated authority at home. Other autocratic leaders and elites were simply happy to pick up a UN paycheck for providing peacekeepers, or for having their armies equipped at UN expense. Many peacekeepers from developed countries paid bribes to be deployed on a peacekeeping mission, where they are paid at rates that sometimes exponentially exceed their salaries back home. The results were sadly predictable. Much has been written, for example, about 134 Sri Lankan peacekeepers deployed with the UN mission to Haiti, MINUSTA, who operated a child sex ring from 2004 to 2007. Perpetrators included a number of senior officers. At least 3 victims were impregnated by soldiers. And some children were abused so frequently by the Sri Lankans that UN investigators subsequently conducted victim interviews in Sinhala, the language of the Sri Lankan abusers. Because of international law governing peacekeepers, the Sri Lankan perpetrators suffered no consequences for their actions. MINUSTA peacekeepers from Nepal were also responsible for Haiti's cholera epidemic beginning in 2010, which killed some 10,000 Haitians due to a failure to follow standard sanitation procedures, a responsibility which the UN refused to acknowledge for another 6 years, despite the fact that cholera did not exist in Haiti previously. At other times, MINUSTA peacekeepers were implicated in extraordinary instances of excessive use of force against the civilians they were deployed to protect. This record of misconduct was so extreme that the UN finally dissolved MINUSTA in 2017. Congolese peacekeepers, under the United Nations Mission to the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, verifiably killed more than a dozen civilians in that country between December 2013 and June 2015, including women and children. The same contingent is accused of torture, public executions, and beating deaths of civilians under their protection. Burundian troops, infamous for employing brutal political terror at home, used the same tactics while deployed as peacekeepers with MINUSCA as recently as 2016. One Burundian peacekeeper ran a prison known for beatings and torture. Another was responsible for human rights abuses against anti-government protesters in Burundi. A third was a spokesman for the Burundian military known for defending the institution's abuses. These were the men deployed to protect some of the world's most vulnerable people. Other misconduct is more banal. For example, peacekeepers in the United Nations mission in Ethiopia and Eritrea used stolen codes to defraud the mission of more than $500,000 in personal telephone calls in 2003 and 2004. While the behavior of these peacekeepers is appalling, it is hardly unique. In fact, from 2007 to 2019, the years for which we have data, the United Nations reported nearly 1,000 credible accusations of serious abuses by peacekeepers, including nearly 700 involving sexual exploitation and abuse of civilians, and more than 4,000 lesser abuses. In my research, which involves large statistical analyses of peacekeeping, I find consistent evidence that peacekeepers drawn from countries with more corruption, more human rights abuses, and fewer democratic freedoms are associated with higher levels of documented misconduct on peacekeeping missions, increased levels of human trafficking in mission host countries, and higher rates of HIV infection in mission host countries, among other negative consequences. And the larger risk is that the quality of peacekeepers could degrade to the point that peacekeeping ceases to serve its stated function of keeping and preserving the peace in post-conflict settings. Something that, despite its flaws, UN peacekeeping does well. So what is to be done? The problem of abusive and ineffective UN peacekeepers is a complicated problem, requiring the UN to revisit its standards for what countries are allowed to field peacekeepers. Contrary to current UN policy, no country with a consistent record of abuses against its own citizens should ever be permitted to provide peacekeepers. And developed democracies must search for a solution to their own paradox of providing peacekeepers. Democracies, by virtue of being democracies, have the least corrupt, most capable, and most rights-respecting militaries in the world, who make the best peacekeepers. But these same democratic qualities, the need of democratic leaders to be responsive to their citizens, make these countries the least likely to deploy their militaries to keep the peace in war-torn places. The best thing you can do today is to take your Model UN simulation seriously. Whatever state you are assigned to play, try to represent that state accurately. Seek to understand how each state's behavior on different issues is driven by their interests. Then you will be able to see how the interest of many states might play out in international affairs. I hope seeing a simulation of complex webs of overlapping national interests will help you understand better the dilemmas presented by issues like international peacekeeping, and perhaps give you some insight into how such dilemmas may be resolved. Best wishes as you begin the 2021 GSIS Model UN.
I now declare the conference open. Clapping is now in order.